February 7th, 1916. Sir, I have the honor to report the shipment today by express in 2 carloads of 50 each of 100 elk to the state of Pennsylvania, as authorized by your letter of September 9th.
February 17th, 1913. Dear Colonel Brett, the 50 elk captured under your supervision in Yellowstone Park for the State Forest Reserve of Pennsylvania arrived in good shape a couple of weeks ago. They are now under fence in a small enclosure and are being fed until conditions are suitable to turn them loose in late spring.
Elk had been killed in great numbers on the present site of the city of Philadelphia, even as late as the middle of the 17th century.
This section of Pennsylvania was the last place to be settled in the east. It was Seneca, Indian land. It was hostile territory until after the Revolutionary War.
By 1750, the elk were already showing the efforts of persecution. Like so many other big game animals, they were slaughtered by the thousands without thought of the future. Many were slain merely for the hide and the souvenir tooth.
And the first white settlers didn't come into the area until the early 1800s, and then only a very few at a time. It was a hard country to get to. It was isolated, and the country was especially hard on women and children.
By Civil War era, people were living on Winslow Hill, breaking up the original forest, doing some farming on it. At the same time, elk, of course, were just about extirpated from Pennsylvania in the 1860s.
As the 1800s unfolded, the increasing human population and demand for meat began to take its toll on other wildlife. Elk were exterminated in southeastern Pennsylvania and rare west of the Allegheny River by the beginning of the 19th century. By the late 1840s, they had disappeared from the southwestern part of the state and from the Pocono Plateau. By the 1850s, what remained of Pennsylvania's once mighty elk population was limited to sections of the north central, predominantly Cameron, Elk, and McKean counties. In 1867, the last Pennsylvania elk was shot.
Gradually, the country filled up. They were attracted in the early days mostly for the open land. The land was very cheap. And then timber speculators bought much of the area for timber. Timber was a major industry in the area from about 1860 until 1910. But after the timber was exhausted, the land was almost completely devastated.
It took early Pennsylvanians less than 200 years to extirpate the buffalo herd, the stately elk, the eastern mountain lion, and even the wolves. Fortunes were made and lost, but the strain of conquering a wilderness was over, and industrialization brought shorter working hours to the laboring man. With leisure came time for meditation and recreation.
Following the logging, there was repeated forest fires, so the land was devastated. Some people thought it would never recover, but there was a few far-sighted individuals that thought otherwise, and that was the beginning of the state forest and the state game system that we have today.
Toward the end of the 19th century, interested men began to wonder what was happening to wildlife. Out of this chaos, and through the unswerving efforts of a few dedicated and far-seeing men, was born the theory of conservation of Pennsylvania's wilderness and wildlife. What was left was to be encouraged and protected. What had vanished might be replaced from stock left in other parts of the country.
I was born and raised in the village of Dents Run. Once it was a former lumber town. There was perhaps 200 people that lived in the village about 1900. After the timber was cut, the people gradually moved away, and now we have about 12 full-time residents here.
Coincidental with the desire to restore Pennsylvania's lost wildlife, a crisis arose among the enormous elk herds which thronged Jackson Hole, Wyoming. During the winters of 1909 through 1911, terrific losses were caused by starvation, and the federal government, in an effort to alleviate the situation, decided to dispose of some of the live animals. The winter of 1911-1912 was the beginning of all shipping and restocking with elk taken from Yellowstone Park.
As there have not been elk in Pennsylvania since the beginning of game protection, there is now no law protecting them, and we have, before the legislature, an act
April 16, 1913. Dear Dr. Penrose, it will be interesting to know if they have thrived in their new environment, if they have proven a nuisance, loss or increase, whether any have apparently attempted to return to their native country, and any other information. Very truly yours, Lloyd M. Brett, Lieutenant Colonel, 1st Cavalry, Acting Superintendent.
If they thrive, we probably shall attempt to introduce more next winter.
September 9th, 1915. Sir, I enclose herewith copy of a letter granting authority to the Board of Game Commissioners of Pennsylvania to secure 100 elk from the Yellowstone National Park. Respectfully, Bo Sweeney, Assistant Secretary.
September 13th, 1915. My dear Colonel Brett, the Game Commission of Pennsylvania has received permission from the Department of the Interior to capture 100 elk in Yellowstone National Park. I have written to Mr. Howard Eaton of Wolf, Wyoming, who attended to the capture and transportation of elk for Pennsylvania 3 years ago, asking him to look after the matter at this time. Sincerely yours, Charles B. Penrose.
January 14th, 1916. If Hop can arrange to the use of Anderson's corrals, after Anderson has filled his orders, it strikes me that the Pennsylvania elk could be gathered in a night or two and save all rough ground and hauling. Yours truly, Howard Eaton.
February 5th, 1916. The bearer, Mr. Howard Eaton, is traveling in charge of 2 carloads of wild elk shipped from Yellowstone National Park to the Game Commissioners of the state of Pennsylvania by authority of the Secretary. Only select elk are shipped, and they were in first-class condition when they left the park. F.T. Arnold, Captain of Cavalry, commanding for the Acting Superintendent.
Yellowstone National Park, Wyoming, February 7th, 1916. Received from the Acting Superintendent of the Yellowstone National Park, 100 elk, 20 males and 80 females, to be transported to Pennsylvania under the authority of the Secretary of the Interior, dated September 9th, 1915.
Pennsylvania made its first releases in 1913 when 50 elk from Yellowstone and 22 from a private preserve in Monroe County were shipped to the north-central part of the state. The elk were divided equally between Clearfield County and Clinton County. 12 of the Monroe County animals were released in Monroe County itself, and 10 were sent to Center County. The elk arrived by railroad at the village of Howard Siding, 6 miles west of Emporium, and were greeted by large crowds of hunters, farmers, and curious onlookers. The elk were unloaded into crates and hauled up over the mountain, pulled by teams of horses, and released on the west branch of Hicks Run.
The last release of elk was in 1926, and they came from South Dakota. They were all bulls, and they were released here in the village of Dents Run. My older brother Jim, he's probably the last person living in Pennsylvania today that witnessed the last release of elk in the state of Pennsylvania. They brought the railroad car in. The elk were in wooden cages, and they released them. He was about 3 years old. He said he can distinctly remember the elk being released. He said one died the next day after the release. There was a hunting season from 1923 to 1931 for elk, but only bull elk with 4 or more points to the antler were legal. So really the hunting would have, as far as I'm concerned, little influence on the actual decline of the elk population. But the fact that during the 1930s they probably reached their lowest ebb and then gradually increased. And during this period, a few people realized that there were elk in Pennsylvania, except deer hunters or grouse hunters or local residents. At least some of the animals were infected by brainworm. It's a tiny little parasite that affects their brain and nervous system. No one really knew what the problem was. They simply called them sick elk. The animals would appear to lose their fear of people. You could walk up and almost touch them at times. So I think that the brainworm was also a factor in limiting the number of elk for years. One fact we can speculate on is that all of the elk that we have today in Pennsylvania are direct descendants of the animals that were released in Cameron County, plus the 6 additional animals that were released here in 1926. It's highly unlikely that any of the elk that were released in other part of the states ever mingled with these particular animals. So all the elk that we have in Pennsylvania today are very likely descendants of those 2 releases. Winslow Hill in itself was one of the most beautiful spots in the whole area, where there's small scattered farms, woodlots, green fields, and wildlife was everywhere. That was prior to the strip mining, which started about the end of the Second World War. World War II changed all of these things. Most people were content to live on the land there. Many of the people left the area to work war-related industries. Almost all of the young people went off to the military, and so the old-timers were left behind. And later, after the war, when the young people, many of them didn't return, and if they did, they weren't satisfied to live here. They'd seen the world and wanted to move on. So many of the landowners leased their lands to strip miners. And in effect, that was the beginning of the end of the farming on Winslow Hill. It was just a series of events that caused the strip miners to move in here. There was a relatively large amount of coal. There wasn't too much cover on it. And again, there were no regulations covering strip mining. They could do pretty much what they pleased. And once they removed the coal, they simply abandoned the land. And it was devastated. The first mining occurred at about 1945. It was very active for a number of years, and then apparently the price of coal declined and some of the operations were abandoned. At first, there were almost no laws or rules or regulations regarding strip mining. You could simply remove the coal and leave the land as it was. And so that's one reason why the land was so devastated. This continued for perhaps as much as 35 years. But during this period, there were laws passed by the legislature that required the strip miners to do a certain amount of reclamation, but it wasn't until the 1960s that a Comprehensive Strip Mining Act was passed, and then the miners had to restore, more or less restore the land to contour and plant it in trees or grasses, and that was a turning point in the strip mine operation.
As that population grew, there was more habitat work being done, game lands were being purchased, so the agency was involved in that, as well as in turning those game lands that were being purchased into quality elk and wildlife habitat, and the population responded. Numbers continue to go up. Other work that's been done in recent years has involved the interaction between elk and habitat. The habitats they prefer, their food habits, to get a better understanding of how we can be effective going forward with providing this habitat for the animals, as well as keeping track of the number in the population.
But early on, it really wasn't intentional, but these extensive timber sales where the timber was aspen trees were cut, and they regenerated and provided plenty of food for elk for a few years. And I think that was one factor that speeded up the expansion of the herd. We started our first food plots in 1972, so not much was done on the management scale until 1980, and the intent was to keep the animals back on public land and not out in the more populated areas and in the agricultural areas where they were causing extensive damage to crops. The strip mines, once the land was reclaimed, it was planted in grasses, so that made ideal elk habitat. And that started in the mid-1960s when there was extensive reclamation work taking place. So in the meantime, elk had increased enough that they were moving out of their original core range even into some of the farming areas near St. Mary's and a few other places. But the expansion was gradual. Elk, when they first started to move out and cause problems, that's what got the public's attention. As they become more visible and more people become interested in them, the various government agencies knew that they had to do something for the elk to protect a resource. But no one ever knew how many elk we had in Pennsylvania. The estimate in 1970 was anywhere from 50 to 500 elk. In 1972, there was a first survey was conducted to really determine how many elk we had in Pennsylvania. The first count, we got perhaps about 76 elk, plus or minus 2 or 3. After the initial survey, interest sort of died down for a while, but I kept on it as much as I could. In the winter months, when it got a little slow, I'd spend much of my time snowshoeing through the area, actually counting elk.
And as that population went up, greater interest was focused on the methods that could be used for an aerial survey to more accurately estimate the elk population. We've gone through a number of different transitions in terms of how we monitor elk, getting a minimum count, which in most cases are observing most of the elk that are out there. Then as we got into the period where we had the hunt, elk monitoring became even more important. It's one of the largest sources of mortality on the population. We apply the hunt to the population through hunt zones, and so we estimate populations within those hunt zones.
There was a research project initiated. It started in 1980. We actually captured some of these animals that we suspected had brainworm and transferred them down to the University of Pennsylvania, and they performed a necropsy on them, and they did find evidence of brainworm. That was an important turning point in the elk management plan.
We went from barely maintaining 100 elk between the game lands and St. Mary's and a little bit of Hicks and Dent's Run to having the elk population almost double in size when we had more food plots on the elk state forest land. During the 1980s, the biggest part of the effort was on state game lands and state forest land. In the early 90s, we expanded. State Game Lands 311 was pretty small yet. It was less than 1,000 acres. And since then, through partnerships, we were able to expand that game lands to over 3,000 acres. A lot of those acres, well over 1,000 of them, were old surface mines that had been mined back in the 40s and 50s and never reclaimed because the law back then didn't require reclamation. So there were open pits, 30, 50-foot tall cliffs. There were pools of mine acid water in them, and there was a lot of just barren piles of spoil. The pH of a lot of that surface was about 4.2, 4.6, and you couldn't grow a crop of grass. It looked almost like ground-up blacktop. And it's a struggle to take land like that had been surface mined prior to the regulations. No topsoil had been saved. And now how do you restore that to a forest land? How do you restore that to a herbaceous opening for wildlife and elk? We took an abandoned mine site, which was barren, and we worked with the paper-making company. You have some residue that you can't use for paper making. This is loaded with lime. Why not spread it back out on the ground somewhere where this lime could do some good? On Game Lands 311, we did about, I think it was 12 acres. They used a great big spreader to spread it all over the surface, chisel plowed it into the ground, and then we fertilized it and seeded it, reclaiming and restoring some of the original contour to the land. It grew so thick, it was incredible to see. The first growing season, we had winter wheat and oats growing on it 2 feet tall. Just turned a barren site into a lush green herbaceous opening. After the first growing season, then our guys would come down at least once or twice every summer and mow it. And by mowing back all that new growth, we kept those fresh, tender grasses and other plants coming up. A lot of people showed up at that first food plot improvement area and took all the pictures of elk. There was 30, 40, 50 elk hanging out in it day after day after day. 20 years later. The pH in that site is still 7 to 7.2. The grasses are still thick. We haven't had to re-lime it at all, and we can maintain it in good elk habitat. It's probably somewhere in the neighborhood of over 150 acres since then have been treated with the paper mill product. It's like a soil improvement product. When they first did it with us, they donated it as a demonstration area. After it worked well, they began to put it on the market and they could sell it. Other coal mining companies were using it on other surface mines, and we'd get funding to apply this product to these barren areas of Game Lands 311. We have areas on Winslow Hill where there's old underground mines. The water seeping out of them today comes out at a pH of 2.8, 2.9, 3.0. It flows down into Porcupine Run, flows into Dense Run, and Dense Run in its headwaters is clean. An unmined area has native brook trout in it, where Porcupine Run flows into it with a pH of 2.8 to 3. It kills Dense Run completely. Then Dense Run flows down to the Bennett's Branch, and it lowered the pH of the whole Bennett's Branch stream. That's how much sulfuric acid was coming out of the mine. And there were 7 mines like that on parts of State Game Lands 311. So one of our goals in restoring the habitat there was also to clean up the water. There's 2 major ways to do that. One is to go in and get rid of these high walls, get rid of these barren landscapes, get good vegetation growing on them in the forms of grasses, which made it good for wildlife. And the other way is also get some of the areas reforested with native shrubs and trees and conifers. But even that can't fix some of these old underground mines. A lot of the land was restored, and where that wasn't enough to clean up the water, we do active treatment in 2 ways. There's ponds that are built on the hill now. They're called passive treatment ponds. But those passive treatment ponds, the water comes into them at a low pH, loaded with iron, loaded with sulfur, loaded with aluminum and other minerals. After they flow through these treatment ponds and out the other end, the water's been basically cleaned up and has a pH close to 7. And then it goes down Porcupine Hollow and into Dense Run. And Dense Run, which probably didn't have any fish life in it or aquatic life in it for real close to 100 years, now has 11 different species of aquatic life, from little mayfly cases to minnows living in it. And in the lower reaches, there are even some brown trout. When we talk about elk habitat, we're often talking about these big grassy openings, the herbaceous openings that the elk like so much and are so vital to supplying them with their grazing needs. But forest management is real important also. Many different aspects of the forest are important for the elk up here. Probably the biggest one is the fact that we have a large amount of acreage that's state forest land where the elk can retreat to and stay out of trouble and just be left alone. And yet visitors and hunters can view them and enjoy them. The other thing about forest management is when you cut timber up here and harvest timber, and you do it under today's regulations, which take a whole lot of conservation measures into account, elk love it. They like these new thickets that grow up with blackberry briars, young trees, whether it's young maple trees, oak trees, aspen trees, beech brush. They need those young forested thick areas mixed in with your mature areas of the forest. Elk Restoration in Pennsylvania, it was moving along slowly for decades. It really didn't take a big jump until the 1990s and right up into the year 2000, up to the present time.
We had what we called the traditional range, which was around 200 square miles of land is where most of our elk were. Over the years, they began to expand outside of that range.
The improvements of old surface mines that didn't provide food or cover for wildlife, they've been improved not just on State Game Lands 311 on Winslow Hill, but State Game Lands 321 over near Pottersdale and Carthus.
In around 1998 to 2000, there was trap and transfer to try and expand the range further. Some of those trap and transfer projects, the animals did very well and have successfully expanded the range even further. Today, 800 to 1,000 square miles of area is typically used by our elk herd. But some of that has been just animals moving out of the traditional range. Some of it's been assisted through trap and transfer.
The impact that this improved habitat has had on elk has been tremendous. We were lucky at one time when we had 30 to 50 elk on Winslow Hill, and now at times we have 220 or 230 elk on the state game lands on the Winslow Hill area. So that's a direct result of the improvement in habitat up there.
I think the elk have benefited over the years from that working partnership with various outside organizations that have contributed lands, monies, and time, and even products in certain cases to benefit the elk, and that is something that the Game Commission by itself could not have done. But because of those partnerships, we have, along with the work of the Game Commission, we have the elk herd we have today. I think in that respect, it is yet again a unique species.
Tourism, you know, there's hundreds of thousands of people coming up here now to view these elk. And in fact, many times that was a bigger problem than restoring the habitat. You know, if you have 100,000 or 200,000 people coming to a small area to look at elk, you better have parking lots and places for them to get onto public land to see those elk. And back 10 years ago, that was a real struggle. And there were some big conflicts, but through the years, we improved parking areas, we improved places for people to go and see elk. There was always talk of a visitor center. We needed something where people could learn more about elk and the history of the area. So the Elk Country Visitor Center was under construction and then completed. And how do we know we're moving in the right direction? Well, there's little indicators out there, and some of them are plants, some are animals. One of the things that's happened in recent years that I think is a real good indicator is we hear more whippoorwills. In the last few years on some of these reclaimed strip mine areas, we're hearing whippoorwills again, something that we might not even pay much attention to. These little asters or these little spring trilliums that grow out there, they make a tremendous food source for a lot of browsing animals. It used to be you were lucky to find a few spring beauties here and there. Now we have areas where the whole hillside's covered with them. And in the future, what's needed is there's still surface mines out there that need reclaimed. Right up here in Elk County, there's still numerous streams that need reclamation efforts.
I think our biggest challenge with elk moving forward is always going to be the elk-human conflict issue and trying to maintain elk in the right areas or encourage elk to remain in the right areas, and they're not always going to do that. In terms of threats to the elk herd, certainly the appearance of chronic wasting disease in white-tailed deer in 2012 and in 2013 is a serious concern for us. It's one thing to have CWD in a deer population that's abundant across the state. It's another thing to potentially have it in hundreds of elk. So that's certainly one of the biggest threats to the elk herd is the potential of CWD spreading into that area.
One of the most interesting questions to me, at least, is why did the elk survive here and no other area of the state? They were released in at least 10 different counties, but this is the only place that they managed to survive. There were elk in Clinton County, Potter County, Clearfield County, and other counties, but at least a few animals remained in those areas until about 1930, but this area here was the only place that it survived. There were extensive stands of aspen that came in as a result of the repeated fires after the logging days. This was probably ideal habitat for the elk, and Again, it was public land or would soon be either state forest or state game land, so that offered a certain measure of protection to the animals. Up until at least the 1930s, there was not really an all-weather road into the area. And so the roads were all dirt and unpaved, so when you wanted to come here hunting or for fishing or any other purpose, generally you come by railroad, really. The local people took a protective attitude towards them, and you cannot discount the just pure chance that they really survived here and nowhere else. So all these factors come together at one time to favor the elk.
Some good things have happened. With the improved habitat, we now have had 10 or 11 elk seasons. We're able to harvest some elk every year, and the herd is still growing. So proper mixture of forest age classes out there is really important for elk and all the species of wildlife we're dealing with. There's no set goal for a certain number. If we end up with over 1,000 elk in this part of Pennsylvania and the conflicts remain low and we can have a hunting season, then that's the number we'll go with.
Interesting, there were very few elk on Winslow Hill in the early days. They were mostly confined back into the more remote areas of state forest and state game lands. It's pure speculation, but I believe there were probably no more than 24 elk alive in Pennsylvania during a short period in the 1930s. That seems hard to believe today. Now we have more than 900 elk scattered out over 700 or 800 square miles.
Pennsylvania is fortunate in having the land and the resources to support a thriving elk herd. This is due largely to vision and foresight of a few dedicated individuals who for more than 100 years saw the need to protect and preserve what was left of our open land and wildlands. For those who enjoy the outdoors and wild things, we owe these early pioneers in the conservation movement a debt that can never be repaid.